Left in the cold. The frost had already crept into Daniel's bones by the time he understood that no one was coming back for him. He stood at the edge of the gravel turnout off Route 9, watching his son's taillights shrink into 2 red pinpricks and then vanish around the bend, and he thought with a strange, floating calm, so this is how it ends up. Not with an argument, not with shouting. Just the soft click of a car door, the crunch of tires pulling away, and the particular silence of a mountain road at 11 o'clock on a November night. His name was Daniel Whitfield. He was 68 years old, wearing a windbreaker meant for October, not November, and he was standing 3 miles from the nearest gas station, because his son Marcus and his daughter-in-law Paige had decided, somewhere over the last 50 miles of Route 9, that he was the reason their marriage was falling apart. That wasn't how they'd phrased it, of course. What Paige had actually said, twisting around from the front seat with her mouth set in that flat line she used when she'd already made up her mind, was, "We just need some time as a family, just us. You understand, don't you, Dan?" Dan, not Dad. She'd never once called him Dad in 11 years of marriage, and he'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a draft in an old house, until the night the draft became the whole storm. "I understand," he'd said, because he always said that, because saying anything else meant becoming the difficult old man, and he had spent 3 years since Helen died making absolutely sure he was never, ever the difficult old man. So when Marcus pulled the car onto the gravel turnout and said too quickly, "There's a diner up ahead, Dad, maybe a mile, you can get a coffee, we just need to talk some things out, we'll circle back," Daniel had opened the door and stepped out into the cold because he trusted his son. Even now, even after everything, he trusted that Marcus would circle back. He did not. Daniel waited 40 minutes on that turnout, arms crossed over his chest, breath fogging in front of him like something trying to escape. Then he started walking because standing still in 34-degree air stops being a decision and starts being a countdown. He did not find a diner in a mile. He found one in 4 closed, its windows dark, a hand-lettered sign taped inside the glass, back after the holidays. By then his phone was down to 11%, and Marcus wasn't answering. What people don't understand about humiliation is that it doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in layers, like frost forming on a window, first a thin, deniable haze, then a spreading pattern you can't ignore, then a solid sheet of it, cold and total and impossible to see past. The first layer had been small, a missed birthday 2 years ago, blamed on Paige's work trip. The second layer, being asked, gently, whether he'd thought about one of those retirement communities, the ones with the cheerful brochures and the words independent living printed over photos of silver-haired strangers playing cards. The third layer, the guest room in Marcus and Paige's house, the one Daniel had moved into after the small apartment got too much to manage alone, slowly filling up with Paige's craft supplies and yoga equipment until there was a narrow path from the door to the bed, like visiting a storage unit that happened to have a mattress in it. And now this, the turnout, the taillights, the cold. He found himself at midnight, on a stretch of frontage road with no diner and no gas station and no plan, and something in him, something that had been quiet for 3 years, ever since he'd buried Helen and folded himself smaller and smaller to make room for his son's new life, woke up. Not rage exactly, something colder and more useful than rage. Clarity. A truck slowed beside him around 1 in the morning. The driver, a woman maybe 40 with a thermos wedged between her knees, rolled down the window and said, "You all right? You look like you've been out here a while." "Longer than I planned," Daniel said. Her name was Renee. She drove routes for a regional produce distributor and had seen in 15 years on the road exactly enough strange things at exactly this hour that an old man walking alone on a frontage road didn't spook her. It just made her tired on his behalf. She drove him to the 24-hour truck stop 11 miles up the highway, bought him a coffee he didn't ask for, and sat with him at the counter while he called Marcus 4 more times. On the 5th try, Paige picked up. "Dan, hi, look, it got late, and Marcus figured you'd found somewhere to stay. We didn't want to wake you." "I was standing on the side of Route 9, Daniel said, and he heard how quiet and even his own voice sounded, which surprised him more than it seemed to surprise her, for 4 hours, in 34-degree weather. There was a pause on the line. Then Paige said, in the tone of someone explaining something to a child, "We just needed a night, Dan. You know how tense things have been. We'll come get you in the morning." "We'll come get you in the morning." Daniel looked at the coffee steaming in front of him, at Renee reading a paperback 2 stools down and pretending not to listen, at his own reflection in the dark truck stop window, an old man in a thin jacket, hair whitening at the temples, hands that had built a company from a card table in a garage now wrapped around a paper cup for warmth, and he made the decision that would end up mattering more than any decision he had made in the last decade. "Don't," he said, "don't come get me, I'll manage." Dan. He hung up. Here is the thing Marcus and Paige did not know, because Daniel had never told them. Because for 31 years he had operated on the old-fashioned belief that a father doesn't need to announce what he's built. He just leaves the door open in case anyone ever wants to walk through it and look. Daniel Whitfield was not, as his son had come to quietly assume, a modest retiree living off Social Security and the diminishing interest of a diminishing savings account. Daniel Whitfield owned, outright, 40% of Whitfield DOS Precision Machining, a company he'd co-founded in 1987 that now supplied specialized components to 3 different aerospace contractors. He had sold his stake in the day-to-day operations 6 years ago, but kept his equity, because his old business partner, Ray Doss, had begged him to stay on the board, and because Daniel liked having somewhere to be twice a month that didn't involve being managed like a piece of furniture that occasionally needed dusting. He also owned, outright, the house Marcus and Paige lived in. That last part was the piece that mattered. When Marcus and Paige had bought the house 4 years earlier, a handsome 4-bedroom colonial in a school district Paige had wanted badly enough to cry about. They had come up $80,000 short on the down payment. Daniel had written the check without hesitation, the way you write a check for your child without ever once thinking of it as a transaction. But Ray Doss, who had spent 31 years watching Daniel make exactly this kind of decision, had insisted, practically frog-marched him to a lawyer's office, on structuring it properly. Not a gift, a private mortgage. Daniel held the note, quietly, never mentioned, never enforced, sitting untouched in a drawer for 4 years while Marcus and Paige made their payments to a bank that technically wasn't the one that mattered. Daniel had never once thought about that piece of paper as anything other than a formality Ray had talked him into. He thought about it differently now, sitting in a truck stop booth at 2 in the morning with frost still not entirely thawed out of his fingers. He called a cab, not his son, and had it take him to a Best Western 9 miles further down the highway. He checked in, showered until the water ran cold, and lay in a bed that smelled like industrial detergent, staring at a ceiling that wasn't his in a room he'd paid for himself, and thought, really thought, for the first time in 3 years, about what he actually wanted the rest of his life to look like. It did not look like the narrow path through Paige's craft supplies. In the morning, he called Ray Doss. "Danny," Ray's voice had the gravel of a man who'd smoked for 20 years and quit for 20 more. "It's 7 a.m. What's wrong?" "I need you to pull the note, the one on Marcus and Paige's house." A pause, the particular pause of an old friend recalibrating. "You're finally doing this." "I'm finally doing this." "Good," Ray said, without asking a single follow-up question, which was one of the reasons Daniel had trusted him for 31 years. "Come by the office. I'll have Denise pull the file." What followed over the next 3 weeks was not, Daniel would later insist to anyone who asked, an act of revenge. He preferred the word correction. A course adjustment, the kind you make when you realize you've been navigating by a map someone handed you that was drawn with your blind spots in mind. He did not call the note due. That would have been cruel, and cruelty had never been the language Daniel spoke, even now. Instead, he did something quieter and in its way far more permanent. He met with Ray's lawyer and formally transferred his equity in Whitfield DOS, the 40% that had for years generated a distribution check large enough that Daniel genuinely didn't know what to do with all of it, into a trust. A trust with very specific terms. A trust that named as its sole beneficiaries a scholarship fund at the community college where Helen had once taught night classes in bookkeeping, and this was the part Ray raised an eyebrow at, a modest, separate account earmarked for Daniel's own use, structured so that no one could touch it, borrow against it, or help him manage it without his written, notarized, unambiguous consent. He kept the house note exactly where it was, untouched, unmentioned, but he changed one thing about it. He had Ray's lawyer send Marcus a formal notice, the dry, procedural kind, full of case numbers and clauses informing him that the private mortgage on the property was, as of that date, being formally reassigned into the same trust. Which meant, in plain language, that Marcus and Paige no longer owed their monthly payment to a father who might forget to cash the check out of love. They owed it to an institution that would not. He moved out of the guest room the same week, into a small rental 2 towns over, nothing extravagant, just enough space that didn't require him to apologize for existing in it. And he told no one where it was except Ray and eventually Renee, the truck driver, who he'd started having coffee with on Sunday mornings. Mostly because she was the only person in the last 3 years who had looked at him and seen an old man in trouble instead of an old man who was trouble. He did not tell Marcus about any of it, he simply let the notice arrive. The call came 11 days later, at 6:40 in the evening, while Daniel was making himself an omelette in a kitchen that was entirely, unapologetically his own. "Dad, what is this?" Marcus's voice had the particular pitch of a man who has just opened an envelope he wasn't expecting. "A reassignment? What does that even? Did you sell the note? To who? What's the Whitfield family trust?" "It's exactly what it says it is," Daniel said, cracking an egg one-handed, something he hadn't done in years because there'd never been a kitchen that felt like his to practice in. "The mortgage on your house is now held by a trust. The payments continue exactly as they were. Nothing about your day-to-day life changes." "Nothing changes, Dad. You can't just reassign. This affects our refinancing. This affects everything. Paige is trying to close on the business loan next month. They're going to run a full title search and see the notes changed hands, and they're going to ask 100 questions we don't have answers to." Daniel let that sit for a moment. The business loan. He hadn't known about the business loan. Paige had been talking for the better part of a year about leaving her job to open a small event planning firm, and apparently that plan had progressed from dinner table daydream to an actual application sitting on an actual loan officer's actual desk. An application that depended, it now became clear, on the equity in a house whose real ownership situation Marcus and Paige had never fully understood, because they had never fully wanted to. "I'd talk to the loan officer," Daniel said, "and be honest with them. That's usually the simplest way through these things." "Dad, please, can you just call your guy, whoever's running this trust? Tell them to hold off, tell them." "I am the trust, Marcus." Daniel salted the eggs. "I'm the one who set it up." Silence stretched long enough that Daniel wondered if the call had dropped. "Why?" Marcus finally said, and there it was, not anger, not yet, but something rower underneath it. Something that sounded for just a moment like the boy who used to wait by the window for Daniel to get home from the shop. "Why would you do this to us?" Daniel thought about the turnout, the taillights, the 4 hours, the frost. "I didn't do anything to you," he said. "I finally stopped doing something for you that you'd started treating like it wasn't a favor at all." The begging started 3 weeks after that, though it never announced itself as begging. It came dressed, at first, as concern. Paige called first, her voice bright and careful in the way of someone reading from a script she'd rehearsed in the car. She talked about family, about how none of this had to be complicated, about how they'd love to have him over for Sunday dinner. They'd fixed up the guest room, actually, cleared it right out. Wasn't that nice? "I have a place," Daniel said gently, "but thank you." Then came the actual number, because it always eventually came down to the actual number. The loan officer had indeed asked questions. The title search had indeed surfaced a trust neither Marcus nor Paige could adequately explain, and a note that had this was the detail that seemed to genuinely wound them, apparently existed for 4 years without either of them once asking who really held it. The loan for Paige's business had stalled. Worse, a routine refinance they'd been counting on to cover a roof repair had stalled with it, because no bank wants to touch a property with an unclear lien history, however technically minor. Marcus showed up at Daniel's rental unannounced on a Thursday evening, standing on the small concrete step in a coat too thin for the weather, which Daniel noted without saying anything about the symmetry of it. "I'm not here to fight," Marcus said. "I'm here because Paige is dad, she's not sleeping. This business was supposed to be the thing that finally made her feel like she wasn't just my wife, you know, like she had something of her own. And now it's falling apart because of a piece of paper from 11 years, from 4 years ago that none of us thought twice about, and I keep asking myself why you'd let it sit there quiet for 4 years and then pull it out now, like a landmine." "It was never a landmine," Daniel said, standing in the doorway, not yet inviting him in, which was its own kind of sentence. "It was always just the truth. I just used to be the kind of person who kept the truth folded up small so it wouldn't inconvenience anyone. And now I'm the kind of person who remembers what it felt like to stand on the side of a highway in November because 2 people I loved decided an hour of quiet was worth more than my safety." Marcus flinched like he'd been struck. "That's not Dad, that was one night we were going through something, we panicked. It wasn't, we would never have actually let anything happen to you." "You don't know that," Daniel said quietly, "because you didn't stay to find out." He let Marcus in eventually, because the cold outside was real and Daniel had, whatever else was true, spent 68 years being the kind of man who didn't let his son freeze on a step. They sat at the small kitchen table, no path through craft supplies to navigate, no yoga mat rolled against the wall, and Daniel made tea, and for a long time neither of them said much at all. "I'm not going to fix the loan," Daniel finally said. "Not because I want you and Paige to suffer. I want you to see something, and I think this is the only way you were ever going to see it. You built a life where I was furniture. Useful when needed, invisible otherwise, moved out of the way when I got inconvenient. And I let you because I thought that's what love from a father was supposed to look like, shrinking, so there'd always be room for you. Dad, I'm not finished. Daniel's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I'm not going to call the loan officer and smooth this over, but I will tell you what I am willing to do. There's an account separate from the trust, separate from the note that I've set aside, not the whole equity in the house, not a bailout. Enough to help Paige get her loan application looking clean again, if she puts together an actual business plan and comes and talks me through it herself, the way you talk to any investor, because that's what I'd be. Not her father-in-law bailing her out, an investor she has to convince. Marcus stared at him. You want her to pitch you? I want both of you, Daniel said, to understand that I am a person, not a wallet with opinions, not a spare bedroom's worth of inconvenience. A person who gets cold, who gets tired, who built something real with his life before either of you were old enough to appreciate it, and who is done being folded up small to make you comfortable. The silence that followed was different from the others, not defensive, not rehearsed. Marcus put his head in his hands for a long moment, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet in a way Daniel hadn't seen since Helen's funeral. I left you on the side of the road, Dad, he said, like he was hearing it for the first time. I actually did that. You did? I don't know how I'm supposed to live with that. You start, Daniel said, by never doing it again. Not to me, not to anyone. And you start by coming here not because you need something, but because you want to. Sunday maybe, no agenda, just come. Paige did come eventually 3 weeks later, with an actual business plan in a blue folder, her hands visibly shaking as she set it on Daniel's kitchen table. He listened to the whole pitch, asked harder questions than the bank had, and at the end of it told her he'd think about it, which was itself a small revolution, because it was the first time in 11 years he'd ever told her no wasn't already a yes in disguise. He said yes 2 days later, not the full amount, enough. The house note stayed in the trust. The payments kept arriving, on time, every month to an institution instead of a father, and something in that arrangement, strange as it was, seemed to steady all three of them, the way a fence steadies a yard it was never meant to shrink. Daniel kept the little rental. He kept his Sunday coffees with Renee, which had, without either of them quite namming it, become something neither wanted to miss. And on the second Sunday of December, for the first time in 3 years, Marcus and Paige came to his table instead of the other way around, and nobody asked him if he'd thought about a retirement community, and nobody called him Dan. He sat at the head of a table that was small and rented and entirely his own, and watched his son pass the potatoes to his daughter-in-law, and thought that it had taken one very cold night, and one very small, very deliberate decision, to finally teach two people what it had taken him 68 years to learn himself. That love which requires you to disappear isn't love at all. It's just room being made for someone else's comfort, at the cost of your own. He had stopped making that room. And strange as it felt at his age, to be starting something new instead of quietly finishing something old, Daniel Whitfield found that he did not miss the version of himself who used to stand very still and very small, waiting in the cold for someone to remember he was still out there. He had remembered himself instead, and that, it turned out, was enough.